Hello my friend and welcome to my Chef Razib. I hope that you are well. Let's continue our section of diving really deep into how JavaScript actually works behind the scenes. I really hope you have enjoyed it so far and are able to see the immense value that this video brings to the table. Now after this video, there will finally be another coding video, so hang tight, we are almost there. But now let's get started with this video. So we learned in the last video that each execution context has a variable environment, a scope chain, and this keyword. So in this video, let's learn what's scope. Whoops. So what's scope and scope chain are, why they are so important and how they work. And let's start by understanding what scoping actually means and learn about some related concepts as well. So scoping controls how our program's variables are organized and accessed by the JavaScript engine. So basically, scoping asks the question, where do variables live? Or where can we access a certain variable and where not? Now, in JavaScript, we have something called lexical scoping. And lexical scoping means that the way variables are organized and accessed is entirely controlled by the placement of function and of blocks in the program code. For example, a function that is written inside another function has access to the variable of the parent function, okay? So again, variable scoping is influenced by where exactly we write our function and code blocks. Okay, and now about scope itself. Scope is the space environment in which a certain variable is declared. Simple as that. And in the case of function, that's essentially the variable environment which is stored in the function execution context. So if now you are asking yourself, what's the difference between scope and variable environment? Then the answer is that for the case of function, it is basically the same. Now, in JavaScript, we have the global scope, function scope, and block scope. Okay? And we will talk about this in a second. But first, let's also define what the scope of variable is. So, the scope of variable is basically the entire region of our code where a certain variable can be accessed. Now, some people use the word scope for all of this, but I like to define all these concepts that we have here in clear way, because actually subtle difference. For example, if you take close look at it, scope is not the same as scope of variable, and so you should know about the subtle difference, right? And I know it may still sound all the same for now, but after looking at a couple of examples and writing some real code, you will understand everything I just showed you here. Anyway, let's now talk about the three different types of scope in JavaScript. So that's a global scope, function scope, and block scope. And remember, scope is the place in our code where variables are declared. And when I say variable, the exact same thing is true for function as well, because in the end, functions are just values that are stored in variable. So first, the global scope is once more for the top level code. So this is for variables that are declared outside of any function or block. This variable will be accessible everywhere in our program, in all functions and all blocks, so really in everywhere. Next, each and every function creates scope. Okay? And the variable declared inside that function scope are only accessible inside that function. This is also called a local scope opposed to the global scope. So local variables live in the function, so to say, and outside of the function, the variables are then not accessible at all. Again, this is technically the same as the function variable environment, but we still need to give it the name of scope in this context, because blocks also create scope. Anyway, in this example here, the now variable is 2021 inside the calc_age function, and therefore we can use it in the function to do calculation. But outside of the function, as we try to log it to the console, we get a reference error. So JavaScript is trying to find the now variable in this global scope, so outside of the function, but it cannot find it. And so there is gonna be an error. And if you remember our cat game project from the previous section, there is also the reason why we had to declare a couple of variables outside of the init function. Remember that? So we had some variable declared in the init function, and then that gave us an error because other functions were trying to access this variable. But of course, they were in the function scope. And so they were locally scoped, and so we couldn't access them outside of that function where they were declared. And here, it actually does not matter what kind of function we're using. So function declaration, function expression, and arrow function all create their own scope. Now, traditionally, only functions used to create scope in JavaScript, but starting in ES6, blocks also create scope now. And with blocks, we mean everything that is between curly braces, such as the block of an if statement or for loop. So just like with function, variable declared inside a block are only accessible inside that block and not outside of it. Now the big difference is that the block scope only applies to variable declared with let or const. Okay? So again, only let and const variable are restricted to the block in which they were created. That's why we say that the let and const variable are block scoped. So if I declare the variable using var in this block, then that variable would actually still be accessible outside of the block and would be scoped to the current function or to the global scope. And so we say that var is function scoped. So in ES5 and before, we only had global scope and function scope, and that's why ES5 variable declared with var only care about function, but not about blocks. They simply ignore them. Finally, also starting in ES6, all functions are now also block scoped, at least in strict mode, which you should always be using anyway. And just like with let and const variable, this means that functions declared inside the block are only accessible inside that block. Okay? And we still see example of all that in the next video, inshallah, when we are gonna go back to coding. So to recap, let and const variable as well as function are block scoped. And if you already know other programming language, block scoping is probably more in line with what you already know. Function scopes are weird for some beginners in the JavaScript world, and that's why block scopes were introduced in ES6. But now to understand all this little bit better, let's actually look at a more real and detailed example, and also learn about the scope chain. And here we have some code with different functions and blocks, and we are gonna take a look at the scope that are in this code as well as build the scope chain. And of course, we start with the global scope, and as you can see, my name variable is the only variable declaration that we had in the global scope. Now, technically, the first function also counts as a variable that is present in the global scope, but I want to keep it simple here. And so I will only consider a variable declaration and no function, alright, okay? Just keep in mind that whatever I am explaining here for variable also works for the same for function. Anyway, inside the global scope, we have the scope for the first function, because each function creates its own scope, remember, okay? And that's and what's in the scope? Well, it's to age variable that's declared right at the top of the function. Next, inside the first scope, let's now consider the second function, which will also create its own scope containing the job variable set to developer. As you see, we have a nested structure of scope with one scope inside the other. But now comes the actually interesting part. because here in the second function we have this line of code where we need the myname variable and the age variable, which were both not declared inside the current scope. But we really need this variable here because otherwise we can't create this string here, right? So how can this be fixed? How will the JavaScript engine know the values of this variable? Well, the secret is that every scope always has access. Always has access to all the variable from all its outer scope. So from all its parent scope, okay? I repeat, always. The scope always has access to all the variable from all its outer scope, also from all its parent scope. So in our example, this means that the second scope can access to the age variable from the scope of the first function. Of course, this also means that the first scope can access variables that are in the global scope, because that is the parent scope, and as a consequence of this, the second scope will then also be able to access the myname variable from the global scope because it has access to the variable from the first scope. And by the way, all this also applied to function argument. But in this example, we just don't have any. And this is essentially how the scope chain works. In other words, if one scope needs to use a certain variable but cannot find it in the current scope, it will look up in the scope chain and see if it can find a variable in one of the parent scope. If it can, it will then use that variable, and if it can't, then there will be an error. And this process is called variable lookup. Now, it's important to note that these variables are not copied, okay, from one scope to another. Okay, instead, scope simply look up in the scope chain until they find a variable that they need and then use it. What's also extremely important to note is that this does not work the other way around. A certain scope will never ever have access to the variable of another scope. In this example, the first scope, for example, will never get access to the job variable that is stored in the second scope. Okay, so again, one scope can only look up in scope chain, but it cannot look down basically, so only parent scope can be used, but no child scope. Anyway, with all this in place now, this line of code can be executed and print to the console. So Faisal is a 30 years old developer, okay? Even though the myname and age variable were not defined in the current scope. All the engine did was to get them from the scope chain. And as you might be noticing, we have actually already done this before in our own code. We just didn't really understand what was going on and how it all worked. But now we do know how it works. Amazing, right? Anyway, we still have one more scope left here. And that's the one created by this block here. Okay? Remember that starting with ES6, not only function creates scope, but also block. However, this scope only works for the ES6 variable type. So for let and const variable. That's why the only variable that in scope is the decade variable. The millennial variable isn't declared with the const or let, and therefore it is not scoped to just this block. Instead, the millennial variable is actually part of the first scope chain. Okay? Of the first function scope. So again, for a variable declared with a var, block scope don't apply at all. They are function scoped, not block scoped. Okay? Let and const, on the other hand, are in fact block scoped. Okay? This is one of the fundamental things that you need to keep in mind about let, const, and var, and about scoping in general. So, if you are taking a note, and I hope you are taking a lot of note, then this must definitely be in there. Now about a scope chain. If the millennial variable is in the first function scope, then of course the second function scope also has access to it, even if it doesn't really need that variable. And also the scope chain does of course apply to block scope as well. And therefore in our or if block scope, we get access to all the variable from all its outer scope. So from the first function scope and of course from the global scope. That's why I said in the last slide that variable in global scope are accessible from everywhere. They are because they are always at the top of the scope chain. In fact, we call variable in the global scope global variable. Very creative, right? But we can actually use this term a lot in JavaScript. Now, it's important to understand that our purple block scope does not get access to any variable from the yellow second function scope. And the same the other way around. And why is that? Well, it's because of lexical scoping as we learned in the last slide. So the way that we can access a variable depends on where the scope is placed, so where it is written in the code. In this case, none of these two scopes is written inside of one another. They are both child scope of the first function, or the first scope. We could even say that they are sibling scope. And so by the rules of lexical scoping, they cannot have access to each other variable, simply because one is not written inside the other one. We can also say that the scope chain only works upwards, not sideways. Okay? So this was a lot to take in, but I hope that everything still keeps making sense at this point. And if not, don't worry, we will see all this working in practice in the next video. But for now, there is one more thing that we need to talk about, which is the difference between the scope chain and to core stack. I get a lot of questions about this all the time, and so I decided to talk about how the core stack, execution context, variable environment, and scope are all related to one another. So before we move to the next video, and once more, let's look at some more code here. So we have three functions called first, second, and third. In order to make this easier to understand, we start by calling the first function, which then calls the second function, which in turn calls the third function. Okay? So from what we did before, the core stack for this example will look like this, right? One execution context for each function in the exact order in which they were called. They also include the variable environment of each execution context. For now, all this has nothing to do with the scope or scope chain. Alright. All I am doing is creating one execution context for each function call and filling it with the variable of that function. And you can pause the video here for a moment to understand the content of each variable environment. Okay, and now that you did that, and we have all this variable environment in place, we can actually start building the scope chain. As always, we are gonna start with the global scope. Okay? And the variable available in the global scope are exactly the ones stored in the variable environment of the global execution context. And given everything we have learned so far, that makes sense, right? And note that in this example, I am actually including function in each scope, unlike we did in the previous slide. Now, in the global scope, we also call the first function, which is the reason why we have an execution context for it in the core stack. And this function, of course, also gets its own scope, which contains all the variables that are declared inside of the function. And once more again, this is exactly the same as the variable environment of the function execution context. However, that's not all, because now we already know about the scope chain. So the first scope also gets access to all the variable from its parent scope, thanks to the scope chain. Now, as we already know, the scope chain is all about the order in which functions are written in the code. But what's really important to note here is that the scope chain has nothing to do with order in which functions were called. Or in other words, the scope chain has nothing to do with the order of the execution context in the call stack. The scope chain does get the variable environment from the execution context, as shown by the red arrows here, but that's it. The order of function calls is not relevant to the scope chain at all, alright? You really keep in mind. Now, moving on the second function now, once again, its scope is equal to its variable environment. Also, it's lexically written within the first function. And of course, it will have access to all its parent scope as well. So we can say that the scope chain in a certain scope is equal to adding together all the variable environment of all the parent scope. And so this is our scope, and the scope chain are built in the JavaScript engine behind the scene. Okay? Now, in the second function, we try to call the third function. But why does that work? Well, it works because the third function is in the scope chain of the second function, scope, as we can see here in our scope chain diagram. It's a function in the global scope, or a global function, and therefore it's accessible everywhere. Of course, this will create a new scope along with the scope chain, as we already know. Great. So what happens in this third function? Well, we are trying to access a variable B, C, D, and A here. Okay? D is no problem because it's right there in the third function scope. So that's one, it's easy. Then, variable C is not in the local scope, and so JavaScript needs to do a variable lookup. So it's a lookup in a scope chain looking for variable C, but it's not there. And of course it isn't, because C is defined in the second function. And there is just no way in which the third function can access variable defined in the second function. And that is true, even though it was the second function was called the third. And so here is even more proof that the order in which functions are called does not affect the scope chain at all. And so here, as a result, we get the reference error because both C and B cannot be found in the third scope, nor in the second chain. Okay? And with this, I hope I made it crystal clear that the execution context variable environment, the call stack, scope, and the scope chain are all different, but still very related concept. And if it is not yet crystal clear, then it is no problem to maybe rewatch this video, or maybe even this entire video a little bit later. And I know that it was quite a long video with a ton of stuff to take in, and so here is a handy summary with the main takeaways from this video. So to start, scoping asks the question, where do variables live, or where can we access a certain variable and where not? That's what scoping is all about. Now there are three types scope in JavaScript: the global scope, scope defined by function, and scope defined by blocks, starting in ES6. However, only let and const variable are block scoped. Variable declared with var automatically and up in the closest function scope. Next, in JavaScript, we have lexical scoping, which means that the rules of where we can access variable are based on where in the code function and blocks are written. And now, let's the magic begin. Because Every scope always has access to all the variable from all its outer scope. And this is what we call the scope chain. When a certain variable is not in the current scope, the engine looks up in the scope chain until it finds the variable that it's looking for. And this process is called a variable lookup, sorry. So it's important to note that the scope chain is one-way street, okay? So a scope will never ever have access to the variable of inner scope, only of outer scope. We can also think of the scope chain is certain scope as being equal to adding together all the variable environment of all the parent scope. And finally, we need to keep in mind that the scope chain has nothing to do with the order in which functions were called. So the order of function calls does not affect the scope chain at all. Okay? And now that's actually it. This is in a nutshell scoping in JavaScript. See you inshallah in next video to see the scoping in practice. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, please, Faisal Azib. And follow me on Instagram, Faisal.Chico. Like the video, share it with your friends. I tell you goodbye. Wassalamu alaikum wa barakatuh.